Hello, my name's Andrew Morrison. I'm Professor of Greek at the University of Manchester, and I want to talk to you about some aspects of characterization in the Homeric epics. In particular, I want to look at the character of Telemachus in the Odyssey and think about how the character of Telemachus can help us to think about how we read and approach the Homeric epics, and what thinking about how we approach the Homeric epics can reveal about those epics and how they present their main characters. As I say, I'll focus principally on Telemachus and the notion of his development in the Odyssey, which has become a topic for discussion in the scholarship on the Odyssey in recent years. But what I have to say also has relevance for the characterization of heroes in the Iliad, for instance, Achilles, whom I mentioned briefly later on. It's also worth bearing in mind, I think, that the issue of how one approaches, how one reads the Odyssey, and whether particular modern critical terms are helpful is something which applies more broadly to approaching ancient literature more generally, not simply Homer. Okay, so let's begin. Telemachus in the Odyssey appears to undergo a clear transformation in his character. If one looks at how he's presented in the first book of the Odyssey, one finds a character who is diffident, fearful, unsure about his relationship to Odysseus, and who is really trapped by his situation on Ithaca, with the suitors consuming the resources of the oikos, and he finds himself helpless and rather at sea at the beginning of the epic. He's visited by Athena in disguise as Mentes, and he says to Mentes that he can't even be sure that he's Odysseus's son, despite what his mother says. He explains further that the situation in which he finds himself is caused by the absence of Odysseus. Odysseus's failure to return from the Trojan War has led to the situation in which he finds himself, with the suitors consuming the resources of the oikos, and Penelope unable or unwilling to decide between the suitors or to reject them all. As he says, again to Athena disguised as Mentes, Odysseus has left Telemachus nothing but sorrow and tears. He has troubles piling up on his head, and the suitors will, he thinks, very soon destroy him. So he's a character who is very much exposed to the troubles he perceives himself as undergoing in Odyssey 1. The meeting, of course, with Athena is what prompts him to begin his physical, actual journey of discovery, where he goes to Sparta and to Pylos and finds out about what people who knew his father thought about him. He's prompted to do that by the meeting with Athena. So it's Athena, if you like, who gives him a push in the Telemachy, in the first four books of the Odyssey, to undergo what is usually seen as a kind of transformation or development. When one looks at how Telemachus is presented in Odyssey 21, so now towards the end of the epic, when he's undergone this journey of discovery in the Telemachy, prompted by Athena, the meeting in book 1, we find a very different character, one who's described in Odyssey 21 as the great Telemachus, and who would have been able to string the bow had he not received a signal from his father not to do so. In other words, this is a Telemachus who is almost as capable, almost as powerful as Odysseus himself. That seems to be the purpose of this detail, that he would have strung it if he hadn't had this signal from Odysseus. Telemachus now is able to present himself to the suitors as a coward and a weakling, or someone too young, even though the audience is aware, because of the signal that's sent by Odysseus, that that's not really the case, that Telemachus is in fact much more powerful. And of course, Telemachus is in on the strategy of Odysseus to recover his position in the oikos and to destroy the suitors, but the suitors are still ignorant of it. And this looks like a development. This looks like a very different kind of Telemachus from the nervous, fearful, passive Telemachus of Odyssey 1 that we just looked at. Therefore, the process of transformation, particularly in the first 4 books of the Odyssey, the so-called Telemachy, where Telemachus goes on this journey of discovery about Odysseus, has often been compared with the modern Bildungsroman, the novel of education or development. For instance, Richard Rutherford, in a very influential article on the Odyssey in the Journal of Hellenic Studies in 1986, says that scholars have long recognized the Telemachy as the ancestor of the Bildungsroman. It's worth pointing out that he doesn't quite say that it is a Bildungsroman, but rather only its ancestor, which is important, and we'll come back to that later. The Bildungsroman is a novel focused on the development or maturation of the main character on which the novel focuses. I've given you some famous instances of this type on the slide. Most famous of all, perhaps, David Copperfield, which is very much focused on the life and education of David Copperfield in a first-person narrative. So we hear David Copperfield's own version of his own development, his growing up. But this process of development, this process of transformation in these modern novels has often been likened to what we see in the Telemachy in the Odyssey. But recently, Jonas Greflein, who's the professor of Greek at the University of Heidelberg, has given us reasons to doubt whether the Telemachy is a Bildungsroman. He's objected to the application of this term to the Telemachy and to the development of Telemachus, principally on the grounds that the modern novels, such as David Copperfield, are focused very much on the individual character and his development, and the Telemachy doesn't show the same degree of interest in the development of the character and the realization of the self, the process by which an individual becomes, as it were, their true self. And its interests are rather elsewhere in the plot and so forth. In other words, the Bildungsroman describes a modern category of narrative which is based on certain assumptions about what the self is and psychological views of character which are not ancient ones, which aren't ones which are found in archaic Greece. That's the basis of this idea that the Telemachy shouldn't be regarded as a Bildungsroman. It's worth remembering, as I said before, that Rutherford, for instance, doesn't call it a Bildungsroman, but only calls it rather the ancestor of a Bildungsroman. And that, as I said before, I think is important. It's important that the Telemachy might anticipate some aspects of the Bildungsroman in useful and meaningful ways, but not perhaps be regarded straightforwardly as a Bildungsroman in the manner of David Copperfield or Tom Jones. But it's also worth thinking about this issue of characterization and development in Homeric characters more broadly. It's worth wondering the degree to which, or examining the degree to which, Greflein is right that the Odyssey isn't interested in the interior life of a character or in the realization of the self. And in this regard, it's worth looking very much at Odysseus in the Odyssey, and I'll come to Achilles in the Iliad in a moment. Odysseus in the Odyssey himself undergoes a process of transformation or development, or is widely seen as undergoing such a process. And in fact, what Telemachus is doing in the Telemachy and in the epic as a whole sort of reflects what's happening to his father also. Odysseus isn't moving from a situation of being helpless, fearful, diffident, passive, like Telemachus, but he is moving from a situation in which he's happy to vaunt his reputation, his glory, his kleos openly, to a situation in which he's much more measured about revealing his identity. So famously, he plays the no man or nobody trick on the Cyclops in Odyssey 9, which is the means by which he tricks the Cyclops. He tells him that his name is nobody, which means that his fellow Cyclopes don't think that anything's wrong when he tells them that nobody has in fact blinded him. But this hiding of his identity is only very temporary in Odyssey 9. At the end, when he's made his escape, he addresses the Cyclops and tells him that his eye was put out by Odysseus, sacker of cities, the son of Laertes, who lives in Ithaca. Not only his name, but really his address, all the information you would need to know to track Odysseus down. And that leads directly to troubles, both immediate, in the form of the boulder that Polyphemus throws at the ship, but also more long-term problems in the curse that Polyphemus calls down upon Odysseus by way of Poseidon. But that Odysseus, that impulsive Odysseus, liable to reveal his identity and claim his glory immediately, is of course one who changes through the Odyssey, develops through the Odyssey, or is usually regarded as so changing through the Odyssey. So, for instance, at the beginning of Odyssey 20, when Odysseus sees some women of the Oikos going to spend the night with the suitors, which makes him very angry, he wonders if he should take immediate action and kill these women. But instead of doing this immediate action, which we might have expected the Odysseus of Odyssey 9 to do, he tells himself to have patience. This is one of those speeches in which Odysseus addresses himself. He says, "Patience, my heart, you had something far more ignominious than this to endure when the invincible Cyclops devoured your brave comrades, and yet you managed to hold out till your cunning notion got you clear of the cave where you had thought your end had come." He recalls his behavior and situation in Odyssey 9. One of the things this is doing to the audience is marking out how different Odysseus is now. He's not going to take immediate action. He's going to wait. He's going to endure. He's going to be patient. He's going to carry on with the concealment of his individuality, his identity, which is taking place in the second half of the Odyssey through the beggar disguise that Athena gives Odysseus in the second half of the poem, waiting to regain his place in the Oikos and to destroy the suitors. So Odysseus here does seem to be a different Odysseus, an Odysseus who has undergone a degree of development. And that, I think, should make us more open to this idea of the Telemachy as at least akin to a Bildungsroman, the ancestor of a Bildungsroman, because Telemachus appears to be going and undergoing his own transformation. And I think this should also give us pause about this idea that the notion of the Bildungsroman can't tell us anything about the Telemachy or about the Odyssey, because we've got here twin developments of father and son, which the epic does make clear, I think. And while it's true that it doesn't focus on those exclusively, there are other things happening, and that's part of Grethline's point. The Odyssey isn't focused solely on or principally on the development of this character. It is, I think, present and important in the epic that these characters undergo these transformations. I promised something on the Iliad. I think it's also possible to see Achilles doing something similar, particularly in Iliad 24. This is, again, sometimes the subject of debate. The idea is, well, how different is Achilles? How much of a transformation does he undergo in Iliad 24? Is he, in fact, going to simply return to fighting and killing when this emotive meeting with Priam in Iliad 24 is over. And those are legitimate questions, but I think we are supposed to see that Achilles does undergo at least a temporary change or development in that book, where he realizes the suffering that he is causing to Priam. He becomes aware, as he hasn't been in the epic before, of the suffering that his actions at Troy cause for others. He's aware of the troubles that they've caused for him through the death of Patroclus, through the distance from Peleus, his own father, but now he realizes that he's causing pain to Priam. He realizes, if you like, that Priam and Peleus are akin. And Priam himself, of course, is undergoing a similar process of emotional realization. So I think we've got several instances, therefore, of major characters in both of the Homeric epics undergoing significant transformations of a kind. And I think it's useful to see those in terms of the Bildungsroman, even if we agree with Gretlein that the focus of these epics is rather different from the focus of modern instances of the Bildungsroman, like David Copperfield. In other words, this modern notion, reading the Homeric epics against these modern novels, can tell us something important about the Homeric epics. And I think that's one of the important things about using these modern notions to tackle the ancient poems. It's not so much that we find that they are straightforwardly the same as these modern instances, but there are important similarities which can be uncovered, as well as significant differences, by comparing these different works in this way. It's also worth bearing in mind that one of the first instances of the modern Bildungsroman is precisely a novel about Telemachus, François Fénelon's Les Aventures de Télémaque from 1699. So clearly, Fénelon recognized something of the potential of the story of Telemachus as a Bildungsroman. And again, I think that points us to an affinity, a kinship between the Telemachy and this kind of novel. Finally, it's worth thinking about what we're doing when we're applying such notions to the Bildungsroman. And it's worth remembering, I think, that the audiences that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about Homeric epics are not simply the audiences of archaic or classical Greece, first hearing and later reading the poem, but also all of the audiences subsequently who have read and criticized the Homeric epics. It's worth bearing those in mind. And they're not, in other words, we're just, if you like, as important an audience to bear in mind for the Homeric poems as their putative original audiences. And therefore, what we see in the poems, affinity as it might be to a Bildungsroman, may not have been the same as the perceptions in antiquity, but they can still reveal important things about the poem, important aspects which might have been missed or neglected by earlier audiences. And that's one of the important things about thinking about this question of how epics are read at different periods, and also how they're received and transformed at different periods, for instance, in the work of Fénelon and others. Okay, I hope that's been a useful reminder of some of the issues involved in Homeric characterization and the potential for development, and also about how one should tackle ancient literature with modern notions.